In 1348, someone asked the church if they could marry a donkey. Strangely, no one stopped them. No punishments, no laws broken, just a quiet ceremony no one talks about today. What really happened back then, and how did they get away with it? The year 1348 changed everything. Not just for kings or nobles, but for anyone with unusual romantic interests in their livestock. The Black Death had turned the medieval world upside down, and the church's iron grip on society was slipping. Getting a donkey marriage approved by the church sounds impossible until you understand how completely the plague destroyed the religious system. The carefully organized network of priests, bishops, and church law that had controlled Europe for centuries crumbled in just a few years. The plague didn't just kill people randomly, it had excellent taste in victims. Priests lived together in monasteries. They visited sick people, they performed last rites on dying plague victims. They basically volunteered to be disease magnets. Entire monasteries went from housing 200 monks to maybe a dozen survivors. Some had zero. Villages that used to have 3 trained priests suddenly had none. The church's carefully built network of religious control crumbled faster than week-old communion bread. Pope Clement VI looked at the chaos and hit the panic button. He started handing out forgiveness to anyone still breathing. Dying from plague, sins forgiven, stole food during the famine, also forgiven. Missed church for 6 months straight, totally forgiven, no questions asked. This created a massive problem. When you tell people their sins don't matter because the world is ending, they start acting like their sins don't matter. Villages began running their own religious ceremonies without asking permission first. Local churches faced an impossible choice: stick to strict rules and watch everyone leave for good, or bend the rules and keep some control. Most chose to bend so far they were practically doing religious yoga. Bishops who used to travel between towns enforcing church law stopped traveling entirely. Roads crawled with bandits. Half the bishops were dead anyway. Remote villages became spiritual islands, making up their own rules as they went. The church started accepting folk traditions they used to ban. Blessing crops became normal. Blessing tools became common. Blessing livestock became routine. The line between official church business and village creativity got very blurry. Some villages appointed anyone literate as their new priest. Teenagers became clergy overnight. Blacksmiths started saying Mass. Even some women filled in quietly, though they kept that information very quiet indeed. Written church law still existed, but who was going to check if anyone followed it? The answer was usually nobody. Villages that used to fear church punishment suddenly realized nobody was watching anymore. This created perfect conditions for bizarre religious requests. The countryside had become a religious free-for-all where almost anything could be justified as spiritual necessity. And apparently, in a spiritual free-for-all, even donkey marriages were on the table. The church's legal system still had rules about marriage, but those rules had some very unexpected gaps. Canon law was like a detailed instruction manual that forgot to mention some pretty obvious things. While it covered human marriage thoroughly, it completely ignored the possibility that someone might want to marry their farm animals. The church defined marriage as requiring mutual verbal consent between 2 people who understood the commitment. Since animals couldn't speak Latin or any other language, they couldn't technically participate in marriage ceremonies. This should have ended the discussion, but medieval people were surprisingly creative problem solvers. But medieval legal thinking loved categories and subcategories. Marriage was just one type of spiritual union. The church also recognized vows of brotherhood, spiritual partnerships, divine dedication ceremonies, and sacred bonds of service. These weren't marriages, but they weren't exactly not marriages either. Religious law distinguished between sacramental marriage and ceremonial bonding. Sacramental marriage created legal rights and responsibilities. Ceremonial bonding was more like spiritual theater that made people feel better without changing anything legally. The church had a long tradition of blessing inanimate objects. Swords got blessed before battles. Ships got blessed before voyages. Tools got blessed before harvest seasons. If you could bless a plow, blessing the ox that pulled it wasn't much of a stretch. Canon lawyers were obsessed with intent and interpretation. A ceremony that looked like marriage but was called something else might not actually be marriage. A blessing that sounded like marriage vows but avoided specific marriage language lived in legal limbo. Church doctrine encouraged people to form spiritual connections with all of God's creation. This included mountains, rivers, trees, and yes, animals. The line between spiritual appreciation and spiritual partnership was deliberately vague. Medieval Christianity celebrated symbolic relationships. Nuns were considered brides of Christ. Monks took vows of poverty that were described as marriages to simplicity. If abstract concepts could be marriage partners, maybe concrete animals could be spiritual companions. The church's real concern was preventing mockery of official sacraments. As long as nobody claimed their donkey was their legal spouse entitled to inheritance rights, the ceremony fell into a gray area that nobody had bothered to close. Canon law assumed that anyone asking for unusual ceremonies was acting in good faith. The legal system wasn't designed to handle creative interpretations by desperate people. Church authorities were more worried about heretical beliefs than unusual personal relationships. Someone who wanted to marry their donkey probably wasn't questioning fundamental church teachings. They were just lonely. This legal flexibility meant that finding someone to perform your ceremony was surprisingly achievable. The plague had created a new category of religious authority, the desperately unqualified emergency clergy. These people were perfect for blessing unusual relationships because they had no idea what they weren't supposed to do. Emergency priests came from every background except actual religious training. Former altar boys who'd watched ceremonies from a distance, village scribes who could read religious texts badly, even educated merchants who happened to know some Latin prayers. These replacement clergy learned their jobs through trial and error. They figured out wedding ceremonies by copying what they'd seen at other weddings. They treated every religious request like a puzzle they had to solve. Rural priests developed a policy of saying yes to almost everything. Their communities were small, isolated, and desperate for any kind of spiritual comfort. Turning down requests meant losing the few people who still attended church. Many emergency clergy genuinely couldn't tell the difference between official church doctrine and local folk traditions. They'd grown up hearing stories about saints who talked to animals, so animal blessing ceremonies seemed perfectly normal. Financial desperation influenced every decision. A priest who turned down paying customers might not eat that week. Someone offering coins or food for a simple blessing ceremony was basically offering survival. Some priests interpreted animal loyalty as divine intervention. They'd seen too many cases where animals saved human lives during disasters. A donkey that stayed loyal through the plague obviously had God's approval. Geographic isolation meant these priests made decisions without supervision. They couldn't consult church authorities or check official policy. Every unusual request became a personal judgment call based on whatever seemed right at the moment. The language barrier worked in favor of creative ceremonies. Many priests spoke church Latin but struggled with local dialects. When someone made a request using mixed languages and hand gestures, misunderstandings were inevitable. Emergency clergy had no training in canonical law. They knew basic prayers and simple ceremonies, but complex legal distinctions between different types of spiritual unions were completely beyond their knowledge. Some priests were genuinely kind-hearted people who wanted to help their communities however they could. If blessing someone's relationship with their donkey brought comfort during terrible times, that seemed like exactly what religion should do. These flexible religious authorities needed specific language to make unusual ceremonies feel legitimate while avoiding obvious rule violations. Medieval people were masters of legal loopholes, and donkey marriage ceremonies required their most creative language skills. The secret was making everything sound religious while avoiding any words that actual lawyers might recognize. Location was crucial for maintaining the illusion of legitimacy. Church buildings were reserved for official sacraments, so your ceremony needed to happen somewhere that looked spiritual but wasn't technically sacred. Gardens, fields, or even stables worked perfectly. The opening required careful word choice. "I pledge sacred devotion to this faithful creature" sounded appropriately holy. "May this bond be blessed under divine witness" brought God into the ceremony without claiming specific religious authority. Every sentence had to sound like prayer while avoiding actual theological commitments. Gift exchange was essential for making the ceremony feel real. Your donkey received a woven rope collar or carved wooden charm that symbolized the spiritual connection. This made everything look like you were honoring your animal rather than claiming it as a spouse. Witnesses served a specific purpose beyond just watching. They recited animal-friendly Bible verses or sang traditional songs about farming and stewardship. Their job was to make the ceremony feel like community celebration rather than individual weirdness. The most important phrase was your statement of purpose. In gratitude for faithful service and hope for continued partnership, I make this sacred promise. This explained why you were having the ceremony without claiming anything that sounded legally binding. Physical positioning reinforced the spiritual interpretation. You and your donkey both faced the same direction, usually toward the sunrise or a distant church. This made it look like you were both making promises to God rather than to each other. Timing mattered for creating religious context. Dawn ceremonies could be about new beginnings. Sunset ceremonies could be about completing daily work. Holiday ceremonies could be about celebrating the harvest or blessing the spring planting. The priest's role was to facilitate rather than officiate. He offered general blessings for the partnership and said prayers for continued harmony between human and animal. He never pronounced you married to anything. Scripture readings focused on stewardship and compassion for animals. Verses about caring for livestock and being good shepherds provided religious foundation without suggesting romantic relationships. Duration was kept deliberately short. The entire ceremony lasted maybe 15 minutes. Long enough to feel meaningful, short enough to avoid attracting attention or giving anyone time to think too carefully about what was happening. No documentation was created or filed anywhere. The ceremony existed only in the memories of the people who attended. If anyone asked later, you could honestly say no official marriage had been recorded. The closing involved promises to continue caring for your animal and gratitude for divine blessings on your partnership. Everything ended with communal prayers for the health and prosperity of the entire community. But performing the ceremony was only the beginning of making your donkey marriage work long term. Living successfully with your donkey marriage required constant performance art. You had to convince everyone around you that your relationship was exactly what you claimed it was, a spiritual partnership with no romantic elements. Physical boundaries were absolutely non-negotiable. Separate sleeping areas, separate eating arrangements, and no physical contact that could be interpreted as romantic. Your behavior had to match your story perfectly because one slip would expose everything. Community integration was your strongest defense against suspicion. Helpful neighbors who contributed to village life earned protection for their personal quirks. People who caused problems got investigated closely, but people who solved problems got privacy. Church participation became a weekly performance. You attended every service, participated in every prayer, and donated regularly to church activities. Visible devotion to official religion provided cover for unofficial spiritual practices. The confession system offered unexpected protection if used correctly. Confessing your ceremony as a possible spiritual mistake to a sympathetic priest created legal confidentiality. Most priests would assign prayer penance and forget the entire conversation. Seasonal explanations helped normalize your behavior. Spring ceremonies could be reframed as planting blessings. Summer ceremonies could be described as harvest preparations. Winter ceremonies could be explained as gratitude for surviving another year. Social usefulness trumped social strangeness in medieval communities. If your donkey helped with transportation, farming, or other essential work, your close relationship with it made practical sense to everyone. Economic contributions mattered more than personal relationships. People who paid their taxes, helped during emergencies, and supported community projects earned tolerance for their private lives. Medieval society cared more about what you did than who you did it with. Geographic mobility provided escape options if local tolerance wore thin. Moving to a new village meant starting fresh with a new community that knew nothing about your unusual spiritual history. Legal language was your friend during any official questioning. Your ceremony was always described as a blessing for your working animal, never as a marriage to your romantic partner. Consistent terminology prevented casual conversations from becoming legal problems. Age and respectability offered additional protection. Older community members and established residents got more benefit of the doubt than young troublemakers or recent arrivals. Gray hair and property ownership made even weird behavior seem harmless. Health excuses explained almost any strange behavior. Grief from losing family members, illness from surviving the plague, or religious visions from fasting could justify nearly anything. Medieval people expected disaster survivors to act oddly. Documentation avoidance was essential for long-term security. No written records, no legal claims, and no official acknowledgement of your ceremony. What didn't exist on paper couldn't be used as evidence later, but your donkey marriage wasn't happening in a vacuum. Medieval Europe was full of precedents that made animal relationships seem almost normal. Medieval Europe was so weird that donkey marriages barely registered on the scale of bizarre relationships. The legal and social precedents for unusual unions created a world where almost anything could be justified if you used the right language. Posthumous marriages were completely legal and surprisingly common. Nobles regularly married deceased brides to claim their family property. If you could marry a corpse for inheritance purposes, marrying a living donkey for emotional support seemed downright reasonable. Corporate marriages linked people to abstract entities for legal purposes. Merchants married their businesses to protect assets. Craftsmen married their guilds to secure professional privileges. The concept of non-human marriage partners was already established in law. Religious marriages to concepts were celebrated as examples of spiritual devotion. Mystics married their visions. Hermits married their solitude. If you could spiritually marry an idea, you could probably manage something with an actual animal. Temporary marriages were recognized for specific purposes. Diplomatic marriages lasted only as long as political alliances. Business marriages expired when contracts ended. Marriage wasn't always a permanent commitment. Proxy marriages allowed people to marry representatives instead of actual partners. Nobles married ambassadors who stood in for foreign royalty. If you could marry someone's representative, maybe you could marry your own proxy. Fertility rituals involved symbolic marriages to natural forces. Communities held ceremonies where people married rivers, forests, or mountain spirits to ensure good harvests. These weren't considered real marriages, but they used marriage language. Legal guardianship created marriage-like relationships between people and dependents. Adults who cared for orphaned children took vows that sounded remarkably similar to marriage vows. Extending this concept to animals wasn't much of a stretch. Property law recognized emotional attachments to valuable possessions. People could leave inheritances to their favorite objects, create legal protections for sentimental items, and even establish trusts for the care of beloved tools. Military traditions included loyalty oaths that resembled marriage vows. Soldiers married their swords in ceremonies that promised lifelong partnership. Knights took vows to their horses that included promises of mutual care and protection. Religious orders practiced spiritual adoption of animals as symbols of divine connection. Monasteries formally adopted birds, deer, or other creatures as representatives of heavenly guidance. These relationships were blessed and celebrated. Merchant law allowed partnerships with non-human entities for business purposes. Trading companies could legally marry their ships, their cargo, or even their trade routes. Commercial marriage was about practical partnership, not romantic love. In a world where you could legally marry a dead person, a business, an abstract concept, or your own shadow, marrying your donkey was just one more option. Your donkey marriage was less about breaking rules and more about finding the right category of existing weirdness to fit into. Medieval Europe was a strange place where desperate times led to creative solutions. Sometimes the most impossible things become possible when the world falls apart and people get inventive about finding happiness.